Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Before we begin, I just want to cover a few items. My name is Kara Jenkins. I am with IMS Global Learning Consortium, and I'll be your host for today's session. So as you've probably noticed, your phone lines are muted, so we ask that you use the chat feature or the Q&A if you have any questions for today's panelists, or if you have any troubles and you need to reach me. We are recording today's session, so one question has already come through, and yes, the recording will be made available. Everyone who signed up for today's webinar will get an email in about 24 hours, and that will have the link to the recording. We'll also put a version of the slides that are shown along with the recording, so you'll have access to that. So let's begin. I would like to introduce our topic, Building a Digital Credential Program for Education. Today's speakers are Karen Daughtery with IMS Global Learning Consortium and Chris Husser from Campus Labs. And I'd like to thank both of them for joining. Campus Labs is a contributing member of IMS Global, and they are also one of the sponsors of the IMS Digital Credentials Initiative. That includes the Digital Credentials Summit, which is an event coming up in just a few weeks in Atlanta. And there'll be some more information about that, but Campus Labs will also be presenting at that event soon. So now I'll turn things over to Karen to get us started.
Thank you, Kara, for the introductions, and thank you, Chris and Campus Labs, for the support you give IMS and our digital credential initiatives. Today's webinar, Building a Digital Credential Program for Education. We're here to share and explore some questions with you, and very fortunate to have Chris Husser on the phone with us to answer some of the questions. The ones we're going to take a look at today are, to start off with, what are digital badges and credentials and how do they work? We're going to take a look at the best applications of digital badges and how to use them appropriately. And then a great question that a lot of us are interested in is, how do I build a badge-based program, no matter what environment I'm in? And then when looking at all of this, where does equity and access fit in? So I'm going to turn it over to Chris here in just a second. And Chris, we may have some folks on the call who are new to the concept of digital badges versus just badges and recognition. So can you kick us off by telling us what are digital badges and credentials and how do they work?
Absolutely. Thanks, Karen, and appreciate everybody joining us today for this conversation. It's an exciting topic and always happy to talk about this technology, and really pleased to see so many of you joining us who are obviously interested as well. So, this question of what are digital badges and credentials and kind of how do they work, I think one of the best places to start is really with, IMS Global themselves, right? And that's, obviously what you'd expect for who we are today and working in partnership with IMS. But truly, the folks at IMS and the consortium, what they're doing is building, kind of an ecosystem of educational technology and interoperability standards that allow a lot of different things to happen, and inclusive of the digital credentials, which obviously we'll focus on today. But there's a lot of great stuff that they're doing related to adoption of these technologies and events and recognition in this space. And so, I think they're really a great place and a great resource to start with. So in fact, as we dive into today's topic around digital credentialing and digital badging, that's really one of the first places I would send you would be to the IMS Global website. Another great resource is openbadges.org. And now this is actually an opportunity to explain a little bit of the history of this technology. And you'll notice throughout some slides on the presentation today, I've included these little short links, for instance, that you see in the lower left of the screen right now that'll take you to the website I'm referencing. Obviously, you can't click on those, but you can jot down the kind of 7 digits and characters you see on the end if you want, or as was mentioned at the beginning, we will have the materials available today that you're seeing today available shortly this week, and so you'll be able to access that later. I believe we'll also try to put some of these links into the chat as we're going through today as well. So the digital badges, is sort of a technology, really starts and I think began to build a lot of popularity as it came to fruition through the work of the Mozilla Foundation, who really kind of started the initial specification and some of the concepts behind what we have today, which is now run and operated by the IMS Global Learning Consortium. And so, as I mentioned when we opened up a moment ago, their website as an organization, they've got a lot of great information if you're looking to get exposed to what this technology is really all about. Obviously, today we'll get into some of those details for you all, but if you're looking for some background information, some great resources to point other people to, maybe you've got other folks that weren't able to join today or technology partners you're working with, these are the types of places you'd probably want to direct them to go learn more. Open Badges, the IMS Global website. There's also a great video that's out there, and I'm sure there's lots of videos, but this is one I've particularly enjoyed. You can find it if you go onto YouTube and search for What is a Badge. This is by the Chicago Art Department group who put this together. Again, the link is there and we'll make that available to you, but it's a great little, maybe 5-minute video that gives you kind of an overview of badging and really the value proposition of the technology and its usage in educational environments. So all resources I would definitely encourage you to check out. I will do my best now to try to succinctly sort of give you a bit of an overview, though, of this technology. So the first thing that I would probably encourage you to kind of wrap your mind around is the badge, right, is sort of an image, is the obvious thing I think many of us recognize, that it's this sort of thing that you can imagine somebody has, online somehow or as sort of a digital artifact. But that really doesn't convey the true power of the technology that is enabled by this standard that is run by IMS Global, which is that the badge or these open badges that conform to the open badge standard, follow a pattern that includes the usage of this data under the covers, right? So it's not just like an image file that you might download to your computer. It is an image file, but it actually has something more, which is all this data baked into it. We call it metadata, right? Inside the actual graphic file of these badges is information on who earned the badge and who did they earn it from and when did they earn it and what did they have to do in order to earn it? What outcomes was that sort of exercise or activities aligned to? The types of things that would allow you to verify not only the authenticity of this badge, but also that in many ways make it a portable credential, right? It's a downloadable file that describes for you, the learner, or other people who you would want to show this badge to, what it is that you did and what you're capable of doing as verified by whoever it is that gave you the badge. So this is all possible because, again, of this open badge standard. And so it's very important if you're thinking about digital badging technology and leveraging it. There are lots of tools out there that do badging, but there are only some tools that are certified as having followed or following this standard. And of course, we Campus Labs are one of those. You can go to the IMS Global website where they have a directory of all the different technology vendors that are out there that are certified in offering this technology or offering technologies that are compliant with the standard. So I would definitely encourage you to check that out if you're thinking about investing in working with a third party. Of course, there's nothing to say you can't build your own badging programs as well, badging applications, but there's certainly a lot of great tools out there that you could get started with as well. Now, let's look a little bit more detailed at kind of how the workflow of digital badges works, right? So if you think about, imagine that you had a technology, whether you built it yourself or worked with a partner like Campus Labs, what would that kind of mean? What would happen when you have it? So let me walk you through kind of a bit of a scenario here. So if we start in the upper left and we imagine organization A, right? Not very creatively named here, but insert your own institution, your own school district, whatever organization that you represent joining us today, you exist and you might have what I would think of as issuing units, right? Different departments or different committees or team structures, smaller, essentially organizational units within your organization, right? That may break down, kind of how you're structured. The reason I show those is to really convey the concept that these badges that you're creating that are in this library, sort of depicted for your organization, could come from a number of different areas all within your organization, right? And each one might have its own separate badges, or maybe you're sharing badges. Or potentially you are in fact using badges that were granted to you by a completely different organization. So in this case, organization B, part of the open badge specification allows for the concept of a badge to be created by one entity and yet shared over to another, such that that second entity may not be able to edit or change that badge, but could grant it or use it or issue it to learners, as if they were the same organization that had created it. Not, of course, with the original organization's identity, but with their own. And so that's why you see this concept of organization B sharing some of these badges into the purple, organization A library here. Now, imagine you're ready to actually give out these badges for the first time. So, you are awarding them, as we call it, to your earners, or as I sometimes will use the word, learners, right? And this could be, anybody in any walk of life, in any sort of educational or programmatic context that you might be working with, right? When you give the badge to this person, now this is where it can be a little different based on one technology provider versus another. But for example, in Campus Labs, in the way that we've implemented this technology, when a badge is issued by you to a learner, you do that mostly just by having to know their email address and being able to either automatically or manually say, I want to give this badge, to this particular person or to this group of people. And what will then happen is a lot of these systems, and again, there are a multitude out there, only some of which are certified, but say, for example, if you were working with ours, we send an email to that particular earner, letting them know they've been awarded this badge, giving them a copy of that badge in the email, and then that could be the end of it, right? They could stop there. They've now been notified, they've got the badge in their possession, but it could also be that they use that email to log back into your system where you're issuing the badges from. So in the case of our platform, for example, we are making it so that when a badge goes to a student, a learner, they can get that badge in that email. They could also log back in and go into what we think of as their backpack, right? In the technology or the vernacular of the Open Badge standard, the backpack is essentially the component of a system that is able to store the data about these badges, right? Not just remembering that they're not just an image, but that they have this metadata baked inside of them as well. And so a backpack is essentially a storage mechanism for hosting these badges. And so some platforms provide that functionality, other ones don't, right? Some systems may allow you to earn or issue the badges to earners, but potentially not necessarily allow those earners to store them. Other systems like ours, Campus Labs, do both, right? And then there's yet a third concept, aside from the issuing and the storing in the backpack, which is the displaying, right? It might be that some websites, again, Campus Labs is certainly one of these, will actually show you the badge or show other people the badge, right? It might be that you want your learners to be able to post in their portfolio, for example, that they've earned these variety of badges. Or maybe you want them to share those out to some other platform like LinkedIn. That type of stuff can also happen. And again, different providers, implement this in different ways, but the workflow that I'm showing you here is largely going to be the same across these different systems. And finally, that last step, again, because of what's inside those badges, that data, it's that concept of verifying the identity of who's earned it, seeing the standards that it's aligned to, the skills that it represents, the outcomes that were represented because of that work. All of that, in theory, should be discoverable by hirers, vendors, other people that are looking at these badges, because of the data that's inside. So the next question that we get a lot of times here is kind of what are some of the ways to use those badges? Karen, I imagine this is a question that some folks online might have asked as well.
Absolutely. And taking what you just said, I want to point out some of those really important words that differentiate that open digital badge. And those words were, that data that's, I like how you said it, under the covers. The portability of that badge. Anybody can build their badge and have it verified. These badges can be created and issued by anyone, and a lot of folks on our call today, schools, online spaces, cultural or civic institutions, community, professional organizations, and all of those entities can build those badges, have them shared out, viewed by third parties, and turn around and verify those for those users. So yeah, Chris, the next question was just, how do you see the best uses of these digital badges? Talking about the best practices, I know that they can represent a limitless set of skills and achievements and knowledge, but can you talk to us a little bit about ways to use them and the best practices.
Absolutely, and indeed, that is a common question. Part of what we anticipated for our conversation today. Folks saying, "Okay, great, I understand. Kind of a high level what this thing is, but really, what are the ways I would use it? What would I use it for? Are there any best practices out there?" Definitely a very common question. One of the places I find that's helpful to start is to think about, sort of appropriate uses of badges. Now, I like to say that there's no inappropriate use. At some level, the digital badge technology has lots of applications. Different people have different opinions about when there's such a thing as too much badging or whatever. I'm of the mind that really at the end of the day, it's like any other, technology and education, right? There is such a thing as too much and there's such a thing as too little, right? So it is incumbent on all of us to kind of find that sweet spot for our particular programs and uses. That said, there are some themes I think that I've seen through my time working in this space and with this technology. In fact, I know some of you today are joining us after also having been with IMS and myself in a conversation back in November at a digital credential seminar, and particularly focused in thinking about some of the K-12 applications. We talked about an example of these sort of brag tags that exist out there in the world, right? And the correlation or kind of comparison to the notion of where digital badges might fit into, kind of the K-12 education space. So we had a great conversation about, have people seen these things? Are they using them? And are they, doing the thing that, at least in this particular advertisement, they are, supposed to do, which is proven to increase attendance. Right. And I think we had a great conversation back in that event in November about, is that really the case? Is that the right way to recognize or motivate behavior from the students? Maybe, maybe not, right? Depending on your particular sensibilities and certainly what you've seen. So again, I say appropriate use of digital badge here with a question mark because, I think there are elements of this that you have to figure out. They might be best practice in some scenarios. They may be antithetical to your, general approach or pedagogy or andragogy in other situations, right? Another example that we also talked about in a previous event, was sort of, using digital badges, with teachers, right, or educators or staff members. So this was from a presentation that I had attended, put on by the Beaufort County Schools, a representative from there, at a NACE conference last year, and really great presentation talking about kind of how they had managed to motivate a lot of their faculty staff members there by having not only digital badges, but these sort of physical manifestations of those badges as well that folks could show off, on the doors to their offices, and how they really got a lot of great, almost like competition and camaraderie going on, but from folks, wanting to kind of show off, as it were, these brag tags, as they call them, for the skills they had. So again, here's a similar example, similar environment, but potentially that has, a lot of great use for what it's intended for. In more of the higher education space, we could certainly talk about some similar examples. I know one that I get asked about a lot is sort of that using the digital badge as sort of an onboarding method, thinking about oh well, gee, at orientation, can we be having our mascot give these types of things out? And again, I'm not saying it's appropriate or inappropriate use, but I think it brings up another question of these badges, ultimately, if you want them to have meaning and value for the learners, what is it that they have to do to get them at the end of the day? Is it simply walking into a room as part of the orientation or convocation processes, or is it really much more about skills and competency that they have to demonstrate over time in order to get them? Again, no 100% right or wrong answer, but these are the types of things you probably want to think about. And certainly another area that I get asked about a lot, probably equally appropriate to think about in either the K-12 or higher education context, is badging in the context of gamification. And people really thinking about, well, gee, if these things are so motivational or really great at engaging learners, can I use it to get them to do the behaviors I want? And, my answer to that is, it depends, right? Again, are these behaviors that you want things that naturally people want to engage with already? And if not, then the badge isn't always going to be the magic bullet or silver bullet, as they say, that's going to change that behavior. So ideally, it should be used in ways that, encourage things that already are natural to the learner, but give them that extra recognition or that extra ability to understand and articulate the skills they took away from a particular experience or program. So let me give you some specific examples that I often see and that I talk to a lot of institutions about, again, in multiple education contexts. And this isn't meant to be a definitive list by any stretch of the imagination, but it's sort of a way for you to think about the broad brushstroke uses of digital badging that are out there and that are very prevalent in kind of educational spaces right now. So if you look at this, and there's certainly a lot to take in here, but let me walk you through it. It's really the concept that badging falls on a spectrum, right? Where you might find, the kind of most traditional notions of where badging as a technology are applicable or helpful are over on the right side. When we think about credentialing or certifying or authorizing or licensing somebody around something, right? This idea that we are going to, give somebody this recognition, this stamp of approval for something they've done. Equally valid, however, may be simply acknowledging or commemorating, honoring, awarding, things that a learner has done, endorsing or recognizing at the end of the day. So there's a lot of different examples within each of these columns that you can see here. What I would broadly leave you with, though, is that when I look at what these each represent as the whole, they, to me, feel like essentially you using digital badging to encourage participation or commitment or demonstrate commitment to something, to increase engagement or recognize engagement, to, in some cases, demonstrate or show compliance with your policies and procedures, or, certainly the thing I know a lot of us are motivated by, which is the recognition of learning or competency. So a lot of different ways to use this technology. The other question I think that comes up with this notion of well, what are these badges and what are appropriate uses is well, are they valuable? Do people find value in them? And here, I really love this illustration by Brian Mathers. I don't know if any of you are familiar with him, definitely in kind of the educational technology space and quite a great illustrator. And so I've always loved this kind of diagram he's created to really talk about what is the value of a credential. And I think he sums it up well here with this concept that badges, as they say over on the far right here, they're in the eye of the beholder, right? At some level, there is a factor, which is the perception of the viewer, the person who either got the badge or is looking at the badge that someone else got. But also included in that equation are things like, well, what is the value of this badge to the organization that gave it out? Is it representative of some cultural or special value that you hold dear? And if so, that certainly increases the value of it in some way, right? What is the value that comes from the meaning, right? Is this badge ultimately indicative of some achievement or competency you gained? Or, as my example was early, simply that you walked in the door at a program or an event? Doesn't mean one's right or wrong, just means that there's something about those different things that may contribute to the meaning value a little bit differently, right? The value that comes from the endorsement inherent to that badge, right? In fact, I would argue that, any badge at some level is an endorsement by the person or organization giving the badge of the skills or abilities or competencies or, completion of some tasks by the learner. And so what is that endorsement level and what does it really mean for the organization issuing the badge to say, yes, this person here has done this set of things, and to us that's valuable because, X, Y, and Z reasons, right? And then finally, what is the value in the journey itself? Is the act of getting the badge, is it part of a larger, kind of educational experience? Is it a one-day workshop? Is it something that combined with a bunch of other experiences led to kind of a meta value? Lots of different ways to think about what that might mean. But mostly what I leave you with here is the idea that there is value in badges, but it's not a straightforward value, meaning it can be complex in terms of really what your intentionality is, and certainly that of the people that you give these badges to. Now, that best practices question that got asked is kind of a separate thing here that I can dive into a little bit. So there are a number of best practices that I would like to share today. So, I think that we might want to take a couple questions before I dive in here, but certainly there's some more we can get into on some of these points. But Karen, let me turn back to you and just see before I continue. Any other questions that we can address?
Absolutely, Chris, and this is fantastic. We've got a lot of questions coming in from our attendees, and I think some of these will be best addressed before moving on any further. So thank you for taking a few of these questions. One of the questions was, how do we get certified to issue a badge? You want to talk a little bit about how Campus Labs went through that process and what that entails, how to get certified in order to issue an open badge?
Absolutely. So I think it probably depends on whether or not you're thinking about it from the technology perspective or not. So if you are from a technology perspective, that's really what the certification process is about at the end of the day, is certifying applications or technologies, platforms that are essentially saying that we issue open badges. The certification process is one where all of the folks that contribute to IMS Global Learning Consortium, which is, it's educational institutions, it's vendors like Campus Labs, we're all sort of bought into the concept. And so we, through that process, volunteers are used to review essentially, even down to sometimes the code or to the example badges that are coming out of a particular technology, to then run it against a checklist and ensure that in fact it does meet and appropriately apply all of the standards or all of the sort of rules, if you will, that are within the standard for what a badge should look like. Different words, and not so much are we focused on the actual appearance of the badge, but when I said what it looks like, I mean that metadata we talked about earlier, right? Does this badge have all of the information that is conformant to the specification? So that's really what the certification process is about, and from my lens, is about certifying the platforms. I'm not sure, who asked the question, but if it was somebody, if you're representative of an organization, then really I would say the best way to give out or to issue quote unquote certified badges is simply to work with a platform that has that certification. And then you can be assured that any badge you're giving out is going to follow the standard, is going to have that maximum, kind of opportunity for portability, usage across other interoperable platforms, et cetera.
Wonderful. So yeah, one of the questions that came in was asking about Credly or Acclaim badges. And so those are certified vendors who are utilizing the open standard and able to issue those open badges, just like Campus Labs is. So thank you for that clarification there. One other question that came in was, are you able to issue badges that are not public, maybe within an organization, or maybe some higher ed institutions want to issue a badge, excuse me, just to give kudos, show accomplishment, but not necessarily meant for public consumption? Is that a possibility when dealing with digital credentials?
Yes, great question as well. And I'd say that probably does depend on the platform to some extent. I can certainly answer on behalf of Campus Labs and say that within our platform, we are capable of that concept. So I do think it's important to kind of remember that the badge, I think regardless of the platform you work with, is ultimately the property of the learner. I mean, it can be defined by the institution. It is an organization, the district, whoever your group might be. It's designed by you. It's, it is yours. But the minute you give it to somebody, right, that becomes their credential. Really no different from a diploma or anything else, right? Where yes, it has your name and your stamp and your seal on it and the signature of whoever. But fundamentally, that thing's now in the hands of that learner. And if they decide to put it on their wall or put it in their attic or put it, wherever they're going to put it, that is kind of their piece. And so I think the question makes sense, but I do like to kind of make sure there's that awareness that, just because you might not intend a badge to be public, really, at some level is outside your control, because when you grant a badge to somebody or award it, they can really do whatever they want with it. But again, we do have that concept, at least within our platform, that you could have a badge that is not by default made public. But again, in most platforms, I think you'll find that there's always control on the learner side to decide what they want to do with it. Share it to their LinkedIn, their Twitter, whatever that might be.
Thank you for that clarification, and that was a great explanation. Along those same lines, the earner is in fact the owner of that badge once it has been issued. Is there a way that a badge can be revoked, or does a badge eventually expire? If we're looking at the central authority that issued the badge in the first place, how much control do they have over how and who uses that badge for how long, or is able to verify what data is inside that badge?
Right. Yeah. And this is a great example of where, again, all the folks, because it was a multi, kind of organizational effort that were initially involved, and certainly some of it dating back to the Mozilla Foundation, as I talked about earlier. But all that work that went into defining the specification, I've always thought was thorough and nice, in that it represents a lot of what the rest of us are used to thinking about when it comes to other types of credentials in the world. So perhaps some of you are AED CPR certified, and you're familiar with that concept that it's only good for a year, whatever it is, and it expires, or the idea that your driver's license could get revoked, right? Hopefully not for most of us, but those concepts indeed exist and are supported by the Open Badge specification. And again, you might find that different platforms actually provide support for the usage of that aspect of the specification. At least I can answer on behalf of Campus Labs again and say that we do certainly have that notion of being able to revoke badges when if you have reason to for some reason or another, or to set an expiration on a badge, so that if somebody were to view that badge or view the data inside the badge, that they would see that expiration notification, or if they followed it back to look at it as it exists in the backpack, they might see that expiration detail there. I've even seen in a couple cases people who've printed, if you will, graphically, that is, the expiration on the badge itself, right? So that just like a CPR card or your driver's license, the literal graphical badge, which again, remember, it has all that data baked inside of it, but the actual graphical side that most of us see when we're first looking at it, that might even be where you'd print those expiration dates as well.
Thank you for that. And as questions come in, we will draw them to the attention of Chris or ourselves. And Kara, I want to thank you for helping us moderate that chat and that Q&A. This is great information. So Chris, I'll turn it back over to you. I know you were getting ready to talk to us about the best practices when it comes to utilizing those digital credentials.
That's right. And again, thanks for the pause on the questions there. And I love all the participation from folks. So thank you for that. So talking about best practices, right? We've kind of explained what are these credentials and how do they work at a very high level. And again, hopefully you've got some resources in your hands, or you'll get them soon from attending today, that you can follow up and read in more detail. Now thinking about some of those best practices, we did talk about, the appropriate use concept earlier, but to me, the following things are just good ideas no matter what, right? So the first one is really to consider the notion of what I would call paths, right? And if you think about the idea of learners and the journey that they're on, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about a K-12 context here or a higher education one, or even outside of either of those two domains, and just in the world of self-education or whatever it might be, this notion of people really saying to themselves, well, gee, where am I at right now? And I don't necessarily mean in the most existential of ways, but certainly in the concept of from a goal that I have, right? Where am I at right now in relation to that goal, right? Where can I go, right? I want to get up this mountain. I want to achieve this end point, this end goal, this end result. What are all my different routes? What are the different ways I could go? And whether that's about a career or lifelong learning, I think these are similar types of questions that one might sort of think about, right? And then what's the best path to get where I want? And maybe there's not just one path, but I think all of us as humans are generally interested in, being efficient and picking the thing that's going to help us best or most likely achieve that goal, whatever it might be. And then the last question that I don't think a lot of us ask ourselves as often as we probably should is, what are the skills I'm going to need on that path, right? I can see where I want to go and I can pick out how I'm going to get there. Let me get started, right? As opposed to, well, gee, what am I going to need along the way? And can I be assured that this journey I'll take, or this path that I will get on, will provide that for me and keep me moving down that pathway, right? And this is very much where I think that analogy of the sort of, scout badges exists, right? When people often think about this, and maybe it's the idea of climbing mountains that brings this into people's heads. But to me, it's back to the digital badge, right? And the concept that technology is really a great vehicle for this kind of notion of helping people understand, where can you go and what does it take to get there? Because remember, inside these badges is that metadata telling you what that badge is for, what do you have to do to get it, what's the type of evidence you would provide. It's again that way to help people understand. And so the path to me should lay out for folks how they can progress. So let me give you a more specific option or example. And this is one that I worked with an institution on that got built out inside of our Campus Labs platform for digital badging. And the goal here was to essentially represent communication as a skill set and to help learners think about how they could grow in their communication skills. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about, well, how do you break communication down? And there's no one right answer for that. But in this case, it was thinking about, for this particular institution, well, gee, we have things like public speaking and presentation skills and debating and motivating, all of these things that we believe align to communication, but that independently are things that people need to learn and show and demonstrate and practice. And so the concept was essentially to be able to lay out these skills in a manner, or you might say in a path, that would help the learner progress and be guided through it. And so part of what certainly our platform and some others that are out there as well will often let you do are things like scaffold this learning journey or this pathway in a way that says, why don't you start here, you're at this green level, you're going to learn this public speaking skill, and you're going to take a course or a class or whatever that is, however it is that you're going to get that skill that is defined by the organization in this case. But then once that badge is earned, right, representative of that skill, it could unlock the next skill after it, right? Now you can move on to presentation skills and then skills in inspiring others. And great, now you've finished and you even get a progress badge for completing the entire, in this case, green level, right? Now the colors are arbitrary here. The number of badges are arbitrary. I have one simple, straightforward row. Each of these levels could have multitude of different connecting, requirements in them. Just a simple example I'm trying to give you today, but one to sort of depict this concept of, from a pathway perspective, how you can sort of guide the learner along this journey of earning skills represented by the badges, one after the other, building on each other, and then moving on to sort of the next level. So in some ways, and particularly I can imagine for higher ed colleagues, you would appreciate this, and even those of you who work in curriculum design, potentially at the K-12 level, might think about the corollary here to a curriculum map, right? The idea that you're going to start with this program or this level of this course, you're going to obtain or be exposed to these outcomes, you're then going to take the next program or the next course or class in the sequence, it's going to build on that material further or build and progress those outcomes till you get to the point that you've completed, the entire sequence or the entire program, which indeed might result in some final badge, right? And there might be requirements, that are set up between these various things in terms of what you do or don't have to earn. But fundamentally, the point is that all of it can sort of result in this, communication badge at the end of the day, right? Or again, completion of some program, if you were to think about this from an analogy perspective. And what's really cool about this pathing concept is that, again, maybe dependent on your platform, certainly at least things you can do in our platform would be to stack these things together, right? It might be that you have one set of programs that power a communication badge and another for cultural awareness and another for leadership skills. And those could in fact all stack together in a way that earns somebody a 21st century skills badge of some sort or another. So when I talked about, again, the best practice here is pathing, this is the concept, is how do you sort of provide people the scaffolding with which to take and grow their skills, one step after another in a sequence that you've laid out. Now, another best practice I would give you is the usage of rubrics, right? And I know most of us in education, and certainly any of us who work in or have a background in assessment, will love and appreciate the concept of rubrics. I imagine that you know them. If you're not, here's a couple just books as an example. Certainly easy to find lots of information on how to build rubrics out there on the web. My point mostly, though, is to convey the concept that the idea that a rubric can help you move from subjective to objective is the key and what makes it a best practice, right? So that if you're evaluating a learner's competency, you're doing so in a way that follows a very structured pattern of here's specifically what I wanted to see or what would be demonstrated to prove or to show that that learner has the competency that ultimately I'm awarding with a badge. So if you're awarding badges, not using rubrics, that's not to say that's not, sometimes appropriate, but it's really no different from grading papers without rubrics or doing any type of assessment for that matter without rubrics. You run the risk of introducing subjectivity and potentially differentiation inter-rater variability, a number of those types of things. So again, to me, it's just always a good practice to think about how you can align rubrics to your assessment when it comes to badge awarding. Now, a third one I'll give you is the concept of alignments. So, and this is, not dissimilar from something that happens in rubrics as well, but in this case, I'm more focused on the concept of alignment to standards, right? So there are organizations out there, whether it's ISTE or APA, for the K-12 space, that have created educational standards. They've done a lot of really smart and good work to lay out what these different areas should be and to define what they look like, and in some cases, even to build rubrics that go along with them, right? I think you aligning your efforts to these alignments is generally a really good practice, and you might find these in the higher ed level as well. Organizations like NACE or ACPA or NASPA all have their own various flavors or frameworks for competencies or standards that you should be thinking about when it comes to aligning your efforts to those things.
Wonderful. Thank you. I was trying to answer some questions in the chat in the background. Lots of questions coming in, and we appreciate that. We're trying to get to them as quickly as possible. But wanted to move into the last portion of our presentation, and really to what we're here to talk about is building that badge program. And Chris, you've got such a great perspective on this. How do we build a badge program, and then specifically taking into consideration equity and access for all?
Absolutely, indeed. That is kind of the most exciting part to talk about, and as they say, save the best for last. But also, I do want to be cognizant of time and making sure we can continue to keep these questions coming in and address those. So apologies if I move a little quickly through this. A lot of good stuff, I think, and hopefully, if nothing else, you walk away today with some of the right considerations in your mind. And again, hopefully, this material will be available. You'll be able to kind of process it further. So that question, how do I build a badge program? This is often what a lot of people walk away from conversations like this one thinking about, or maybe you already were wondering about. That's what brought you here today. My answer to this question, is that you shouldn't. You shouldn't build a badge program. What you should do is build a program and then add badges. Right? So let me say that again. Essentially, if in your mind you're imagining, gee, I really want to get into this badging thing, how can I invent a brand new program and start doing badging with it? My general advice, 100% of the time is, can you take something you're already doing really well and simply add badges to it, rather than inventing a brand new program, a brand new set of assessment methodologies, a brand new set of standards and alignments and rubrics, all the things we've talked about today. Why reinvent the wheel? You're all presumably, I assume, educators in various ways and means. You do education, you do these programs, you do these services. Don't reinvent the wheel. Look for opportunity to incorporate badging into what you're already doing. So let me walk you through kind of how I might approach that. For example, if you were going to build a program, certainly I can talk about that here, but I also want to just remind you that, these are probably things you've already done, and can you just simply leverage them, right? So for instance, one of the first places I would start if I was designing a program, badging or not, from scratch, would be to think about the impact I'm trying to create, right? Am I ultimately gearing this program around improving the effectiveness of my teachers or the learning of my students, or am I doing it to build on the brand awareness of my organization? Am I trying to create behavioral change? There's any number of answers and no right one to what it is you're trying to see happen in the world because of this program you've created or the service that you offer. That to me is the most fundamental place you need to start. And if you're starting with something you already have, but you're not really sure what's your impact, this is step one. Start by having conversations with your colleagues about what is the real impact of what you're doing and why is it that you do what you do, because that really roots and centers everything else you're going to have to think about in building a program. Now, the second step I would give you is to think about your purpose. It's a little bit different from the impact. The impact being really, what do you want to see happen in the world? But the purpose is really, why are you doing that thing? And that can be driven by a number of elements, like, who are you, right? Are you focused on administration or student guidance or curriculum development? Are you driven by the need to collect data or increase engagement or improve retention? And then ultimately, you also have to think not about just those two elements, who are you and your goals around you, but I'd say you have to think about your audience as well. Who are their personas? Are they young students or older non-traditional students? What are their values, their objectives? What's their level of digital literacy? I think is often important to think about if you're, especially if you do have this notion in your mind of applying badges and inherently digital technology to your existing programs or services. Now, third step would be to think about your competencies. And this is probably where most people jump in when it comes to designing programs, is to say, well, what are the competencies we're trying to build? They skip over the impact and the purpose steps, which is understandable. But again, my advice would be to not take those lightly. But then when you do get through those, thinking about what are the competencies I'm trying to focus on. Ultimately, am I trying to promote competencies that are related to the well-being and general life of an individual, or is it more specific to a given workplace? Are they industry-wide or industry-specific competencies? Are they specific to a particular occupation, or are they managerial in nature? Again, no right answer here. The point is just that you need to define exactly what types of competencies you are looking to define. I think sometimes the trap people fall into is to just sort of, do the shopping cart approach and take all the things that sound good and lump them together. And maybe that is appropriate, but then I think it's important to recognize, when you are cutting across these different places in which your learners will use those competencies, and to ensure that you truly are putting together a combination of things that makes sense, from the learner's perspective. Now, step 4 in this process would be to think about the program structure. But before I go there, a couple of extra pieces of advice I'd like to give related to thinking about those competencies. So, thinking about that lens that your learners bring. I mentioned earlier that you want to remember their values and their competency level of digital literacy, their personas. But in this case, when I talk about their lens, what I really mean are things like thinking about how they might perceive some of those competencies. So, for example, a question I often ask, and sometimes it's uncomfortable for people when I ask it, but I ask them to think about what's a competency that's different across the gender spectrum. And whether there is or isn't such a competency, there's certainly examples out there and research that people might point to where they would talk about something like leadership as an example, where there are different leadership styles that correlate to to different gender. Again, not saying that is or isn't the case, and you follow that research as you see fit, but it's the type of question is more my point today to get you thinking about, which is leadership doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to everybody in your audience. And maybe that has nothing to do with their gender, but the point is still, it's not going to always be the same for everybody. That's something you have to take into consideration. Another example might be thinking about what's a competency that differs across cultures. The answer I would give you here, for example, is teamwork, right? A much more collectivist culture would think about teamwork very differently from a much more individualistic culture would, right, in terms of how they think about achievement and the value therein. Or thirdly, what's a different competency that might be different based on power dynamics, right? The answer here, or one answer anyway, being conflict resolution. Thinking about that as a competency probably looks very different to somebody who grew up in a part of the world that is, sort of rife with conflict and that type of, political struggle versus, some other area of the world where conflict resolution, may mean the fight you get into with your sibling, right? Two very different sets of experiences related to that power dynamic and that notion of conflict resolution. And it's just the type of thing you have to be mindful of and think about what are the people bringing to the table. Not everyone's starting at the same spot with these competencies or how they even think about them. Okay, so step 4, the program structure, right? Again, a simple one, also a place a lot of people tend to dive into very early on in this process. Gee, well, why don't we invent a 6-week program? That'll be a great opportunity to teach them what we need, right? Maybe, right? That has nothing to do with really a right or wrong answer, yet again, as I've said a number of times today, but just the point is that you think about it. What is the format of this program or service? Is it a workshop? Is it a extended sort of placement? Is it going to take place inside the community or at my school or my organization? Will it last a whole year or the semester? Is there some sort of sequencing to it where you have to complete, a 101 and then graduate into a senior level or 201? And is there any incentive involved? Is there some certificate or prestige that will come along with this, or even a pay increase, if it's something that's focused on faculty or staff? Now, another area of consideration I'd give to you in this case related to the program structure would be to think about the accessibility, right? Are you requiring a fee? Are you hosting it at a location that's accessible? Could somebody who's got time commitments outside of school or work, who maybe they're supporting a family, would they find it difficult to complete your program? Doesn't mean that, you have to make sure all those things are true, but if you are committed to sort of thinking about equity and access and things like that, there's certainly questions you'd want to answer. And this is where I'd point you again to a resource. Again, we'll make these links available to you, but there's a concept out there. I won't explain it in a ton of detail, but universal design, really great idea, something that you can check out on, read more about online. But basically the concept that when you design with accessibility in mind, it's not just about making good design for people who have different situations or abilities from the rest of us. It's actually about designing things in a way that work for everybody, and that in fact makes the best design at the end of the day. So it's just a little different way of thinking about some of these types of things, a resource I really like to plug whenever I get a chance. All right, so now thinking about the assessment plan, right? How am I going to assess this thing that I built? Again, I expect most of you today have exposure or experience doing assessment. You're used to thinking about learning outcomes and competencies, the plan, do, check, act, or PDCA cycle, the assessment loop, maybe you've heard that called as. I think the most important thing is just making sure you can do things like say, the purpose of my assessment is to blank, right? And that by assessing whatever population it is using a given method you've selected, you're going to be able to, and then how will you use those results, right? If you can't fill in that Mad Lib, then you probably need to spend a lot more time thinking about your assessment plan and your approach for the program. Now, again, an example of where you can think about this from sort of the equity and access perspective, another resource I'd point you to, and this one actually belongs to Campus Labs, so thinking about the socially just assessment, that hyperlink there will take you out to some resources that we provide, because we're big proponents of this concept. As a data company and a company that has a lot of background in assessment, we think about this a lot, and so there's a lot of time we've invested in curating and bringing together some resources around that, so I definitely encourage you to check those out. Basically some of the questions that you'd be thinking about if you're going to take a socially just assessment approach is to really think about what constitutes learning and how is it demonstrated. Is the language I'm using in my outcomes appropriate? Am I using multiple methods of assessment? I'm not a big user of cartoons necessarily in presentations, but I've always really appreciated this one. Great illustration that I think really sums up this concept of what you need to be thinking about when it comes to your assessment approach. And again, it's ensuring that you're doing so in a fair and equitable and accessible way. Now, I mentioned, or at least on the slide a moment ago, I had this concept of the balance wheel. It's just another example of something you could think about. For those of you who are used to looking at Bloom's taxonomy and that notion of the more cognitive types of assessment methodologies, just remembering that there are other ways to do that sort of assessment, and that other cultures and viewpoints in the world put as much emphasis on some of the non-cognitive elements, emotional, physical, spiritual. So, you may want to be considering if there are ways in which your population would benefit from you incorporating those types of assessment practices into your program as well. So with that, you've gotten to the point where now we've kind of gotten through thinking about how to build your program, or ensuring that a program you already have is aligned to some of these best practices and certainly considerations of access and equity. Let's talk about that badging component real quick to kind of wrap up today and leave some time for some questions. So when it comes to the first step of applying badging to a program you already have, the first thing I do, not dissimilar from what we went through a moment ago with the first 6 steps, is to think about your purpose, right? Are you trying to scaffold learning by adding badges to your program? Are you trying to assess competency? Are you trying to create a credential or gamify and make the experience more engaging? Do you want to incentivize and create motivation? Are you trying to create more brand awareness by having these badges out there in the world with your institution's name and seal on them? Or are you simply trying to recognize or commemorate, some achievement of your participants? It can be multiple of these things, but I think the important thing is that you stop and think about which one or ones you're really after, because you'll find, I think, that it drives a lot of your design decisions around how to implement the badging. And again, remember from that slide I showed you at the beginning with the 6 columns and the different uses of badging, there are, at least in my experience, some very key common things that ultimately people will answer with this type of thing. Are you trying to focus on participation, commitment, engagement, compliance, learning, or competency? That may be one of the simplest places you could start, is by figuring out which of those 6 you're really focused on. Now, the next segment is one that probably I won't spend as much time on as it deserves to think about, but I'll just, again, whet your appetite here with this concept of badging topology. So for those that are in the open badging space and familiar with kind of the technology, the specification, when we talk about topology, what we mean is the arrangement or the organization of the parts, right? And what that really means in the concept of badging is thinking about how the badges or the skills that they represent connect to each other. right? So we talked about pathways, for example, earlier, and how you could group together and sequence different experiences or skill opportunities for earning badges. If you think about, there's a number of ways to do that that are more prescriptive in nature, right? If you go to a conference, you might have different tracks you can choose from that guide which things you attend, right? Or if you're doing guided pathways at a community college, these would be examples of prescriptive topology, prescriptive pathways that sort of guide a person along, right? Versus a more descriptive or emergent serendipitous approach where you may just have a bunch of different skills and show how they're connected together, but you essentially don't care where the learner starts, right? So the idea here is really just to think about how do you want your badges or your skills connected together. So I often encourage people to think about, well, what would happen? What does a learner have to do to get a badge, right? Do they have to complete some set of requirements? Is it about a single experience? Is it individual tasks you have them do? Essentially, is it a more macro or micro level thing that you'd use to demonstrate that achievement? That often helps people really think about, what their topology is for the program or the use of badging within their program. Now, from a design perspective, again, this is a whole other topic that could be maybe another webinar we would do in the future, but there's a lot that goes into the graphical aspect of badging, badge design. My main advice to you here today would be to involve graphic designers. If you have access to those resources, they are the right type of people to bring into the conversation early, right? Even when you're thinking in those first 6 steps about the program, those are the types of people you want at the table so they can be aware of where the thing is going and kind of what the purpose is, so that they can better influence the design. And there's a lot of things they can think about from an accessibility perspective too when it comes to good graphical design elements. And then finally, the platform itself, right? I've mentioned this a couple times today, but there's a number of platforms out there, only some of which are certified by IMS Global to do a lot of the types of things we're talking about today with this standard. Certainly Campus Labs, our milestone platform, is one of those. But the URL you're seeing on the screen that we can make available to you will take you to the directory and the open source, on the IMS Global page, where you can see those different platforms that are out there.
All right. So yes, Chris, that was a lot of information, and you did a fabulous job. Had a lot of questions coming in around the availability of this recording and the availability of this slide deck. So as Kara mentioned at the beginning, we will be sharing this information with you. If you have registered for today's webinar, you will receive an email letting you know the details of how this information will be shared, and the recording and the slide deck will be available on our IMS website. So one of the questions that just came in was, will we get a badge for attending today? Great question. I wish we could have done that. So much to cover in such a short amount of time. I will tell you guys, as Kara mentioned, Campus Labs is a sponsor of our Digital Credential Initiative, and they are a huge sponsor of our Digital Credential Summit that is taking place just a couple of weeks away in Atlanta, Georgia. And Chris is actually going to be doing a presentation, and we'll be there to answer questions in person. So our Digital Credential Summit is a 2-day event. The first day is full of keynotes, panels, and lightning talks, one of which Chris will be a part of. And the second day is going to be breakout sessions that are focused toward higher ed and K-12, and all about bringing digital credentials to bring about that acknowledgement of lifelong learning. Another event that we want to make sure that you guys are aware of that we have annually is our Learning Impact Leadership Institute conference that takes place each summer. This year it's going to be out in Denver, Colorado, and registration is open, and the agenda and our list of speakers are starting to fill up online, so check that out and get registered for that. And before we leave you, we would just want to give you guys a couple of action items to get more information about IMS and the resources we have available to higher ed and IMS K-12 members and K-12 public. We want you to access those resources on our website. A lot of those resources are created by institutional members just like yourself for others. If you're interested to hear more about IMS or have deeper questions into what Chris has covered, or open badges and the standards and the certification process around open badges, please schedule a meeting with us at IMS Global following the URL info@imsglobal.org, and we will be sure to set up a meeting with you. Make sure that you register for those upcoming events, both in February and the one in May. We appreciate you being here. Chris, thank you again for being here, and thank you everybody for joining us and learning how building a digital credential program for education is possible with that step-by-step approach given to us by Chris. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Karen.